And we're live.
Hooray. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to everyone out there watching this live
Happy
stream.
Friday.
Indeed.
And sorry for the delay.
Some technical issues.
But we're here.
We're here.
Yeah.
And we're ready to talk about having an open mind when you're first introduced to someone or when you are introducing yourself to someone. And first impressions in general, I think. So we put out a video earlier this week about how to change your opinion of someone. And this is something that, I think we can all benefit from, because you might meet someone and you might be interacting with them, but you just can't seem to have the most favorable impression of them. And it might not be your fault or their fault. It just is what it is.
You're not clicking.
Exactly. The rapport is not there. So what do you do in that situation? It's one thing if it's like a one and done, like the person and you interact with them so rarely that it doesn't really make a material difference how well you get along. But think about someone that you interact with on a regular basis. Think about someone that might be in your immediate family, your extended family, or your colleagues or your managers or your neighbors, people that you are in frequent contact with.
Right.
And that's really what that video is about.
Right.
Right?
Yep. Exactly. And, when it comes to first impressions, we've all heard that most of what people decide about you is decided in that first instance.
Right.
And in many cases, that's true. Particularly if your interactions are limited. And so when we talk about first impressions, you can really talk about it from two perspectives. One is the first impression that you have of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second side of the story is the impression they have of you in that first moment. So I think we can tackle it from both angles.
Definitely.
But again, the goal with this conversation isn't just specifically about first impressions, but it's also how do you make and how do you, in yourself, instill a good first impression of the other person.
Exactly.
Because generally speaking, we'd rather have a good impression than a bad impression. Obviously, we want to make a good impression of someone else, but we also want to have a good impression of them, because when that happens, when you can click, then you can have a much richer conversation, a much more productive conversation, and you have a better outcome.
Yeah, and the meaning and the interactions are richer and deeper and more meaningful, right?
Yep.
You can express your authentic self.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not this superficial kind of banter. It's more of the deep stuff, which is always great, right?
Yes, definitely.
So the first thing, is to have an open mind. If you're the person, both sides, right? And so what does that mean? Well, the first thing that comes to mind with that is to, keep your judgments at bay and to try not to make assumptions about the person. So they might remind you of someone that you might not have a great impression of. They might have the same name as someone that you might not have a great impression of. Don't let that kind of noise, decide on how you are going to interact with this person or interfere with your, communication with them. Right?
Yeah, no, I think assumptions are a really good place to start, because we're sort of hardwired to make assumptions, right?
Exactly.
Assumptions help us make decisions, right? They shortcut a path to an action, right? So we make assumptions because in the wild that saves our lives.
Yeah.
We assume we can't outrun the tiger, so instead we're going to have to, stand and fight our ground,
Exactly.
right? Hold our ground.
Yeah.
So you have to make assumptions, and those are important to do. But when it comes to people are so complex, and these days come from such different backgrounds than ourselves, that assumptions can be really tricky, right? Because it's easy to make the wrong assumptions.
Yeah.
Particularly in the context of having a conversation where you have a desired outcome. when you make an assumption, you sort of preset
Right.
how
Yeah.
the conversation is going to go.
Exactly.
And if you made the wrong assumption, then you can run into friction, right? You
Yeah.
can run into barriers.
Exactly.
And that can really disrupt the flow of the conversation. So instead, by going into the conversation without any assumptions, and instead, you have a blank canvas and you kind of just let the conversation flow and you make an analysis on the fly, you are much more likely to be open and receptive to the reality as opposed to the preconceived notion of how it's going to go.
Right, exactly. And you said preconceived notions, right? That's a really great way of understanding it, because when we think of stereotypes, or when we think of, archetypes, or you pigeonhole someone into a character, or, an impression of them, it's not always factual, right? It's our preconceived notions about how we treat that assumption or that stereotype, right? And then we run into all sorts of tricky business.
Yeah.
And it's rarely that we get it right. We get those assumptions right. It's often, 360 degrees from
Or
where,
180.
or 180 from where, yeah, that's right. 180 from where you, first started with that.
Yeah, there's actually a funny story from college. We both went to the same college, Hamilton College.
Woo!
And our college was funny because it was divided into two sides informally. You had the light side and the dark side. And the light side were the preppy types, and the dark side were kind of the crunchy, artsy types, right? And so people on the dark side always assumed they wouldn't get along with people on the light side. And I was a dark sider, so I was considered crunchy. I liked campfires and going into the woods. And I assumed that anytime I'd interact with a light sider, we wouldn't have much in common, that we wouldn't be able to connect. And it took me several years of being there to finally realize that that was a false assumption. It was a poorly conceived preconception, because I started interacting with these light siders, and it turns out they were very interesting people, right? We all had very interesting backgrounds and interesting perspectives. And I was so frustrated at myself by the end of college because for the first half of it, I had cut off interactions with this whole part of the campus that I never realized I'd actually could be friends with. And what I always found cool about Mary Daphne was she was one of these chameleons. So she was a bit on one side, a bit on the other. And you, I think, did a much better job of setting aside your assumptions and, openly interacting with everyone. And I think it benefited you very well.
Yeah, I mean, my goal was to sort of, set the preconceived notions aside and just try to learn from everyone, and be friends with lightsiders and darksiders, and me myself to traverse both. And it ends up being a great experience. I made a lot of friends, and wherever we travel, we find people from Hamilton that we knew.
Totally.
So that was always like a really fun plus, because
Yeah.
you build these connections, and they might not be the strongest of connections, but you set good rapport, you create a meaningful interaction, an authentic exchange with them. And again, it doesn't take much for it to be memorable. So years later, 10 years later, you're like, hey, do you remember? Of course I remember you, kind of thing. And it's always
Yeah.
really nice.
Yeah.
Right? So that's sort of what we want to achieve with having this open mind and setting aside our preconceived notions and our assumptions. And it is challenging to do, but with practice you get used to it. So as a little game, what you can do is, when you're interacting with someone that you know well or not, whenever an assumption or a judgment or an opinion of them, a negative one, pops into your head, cast it aside, right? Just like push it away, and see how much you can do that. And as you continue to do that, you'll notice that you'll stop having you'll stop making judgments like that off the bat. You'll just really be listening to the person and trying to understand who they are as a person.
Yeah, that's great. And what that requires, part of the reason I love that
Yeah.
is it requires you to be very present with your own feelings during the conversation. It's easy when you're speaking with someone to sort of uh, to lose track of the way you're feeling, right? And to let that happen automatically.
Yeah.
And that's when we start to say things or think things that might not be true, that are instead, coming from a place of lack of knowledge,
Yeah.
lack of understanding. So if you instead pay attention to the feelings that you're experiencing while you're talking, which is a lot easier said than done,
Yes.
when you pay attention to them, you can start to pick up on a situation where you might have a bias that
Yes.
you weren't necessarily
Aware
cognizant of
of.
up front,
Right.
right? And you can course correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like you were saying, if someone says something, they're like, oh boy, this is this kind of person, we're not gonna get very far here,
Yeah.
right?
Or like we have nothing in common.
Exactly. If that pops into your head, recognize that it does, right? You say, oh wow, I just experienced, a cognitive bias of
Yep.
some sort.
Yep.
I'm gonna set that aside, right?
Exactly.
And once you do, it's not that that doesn't possibly present a red flag. It could,
It could.
but that's an opportunity then to explore it, right?
Exactly.
If someone says something that you think doesn't align with your values
Yep.
or your perspective,
Yep.
instead of hardening yourself to that person and saying, well, we're not going to get along,
Exactly.
explore that contrast between your perspective and theirs, and try to understand why they have that perspective, right? And
Yep.
I think that's a beautiful way to essentially disarm one of these conversation blockers and convert it into a conversation enabler.
Exactly. I love that. It's so true, Greg. And what's funny is, so we mentioned not making assumptions, right? But there is one thing that you can make an assumption about. You know what that is?
Tell me.
Okay. It's about having multiple perspectives and worldviews. So, for example, if I'm talking to someone, I can assume that their worldview, their perspective, their outlook on life, their field of experience is going to be different from my own. Right? And that's a beautiful thing because, like you said, you can use that as a conversation enabler. You can use that as, fodder for learning more about the person and where they're from and where they've traveled to and where they grew up and where they were, I don't know, where they experienced life and all of this stuff.
Right, sure.
So
I love that.
making assumptions about them having a different worldview. And when we talk about worldview, what pops into mind is symbolic interactionism, how we all interact with symbols differently.
Yeah.
Right? And so
totally.
that's a big one.
You did a
Yeah.
really good video on symbolic interactionism
Yeah.
A few months back.
Yeah.
If that term sounds
It's a
long and
mouthful.
scary, you're in good company.
Yeah.
But we actually have 2 videos on that. So
Yeah.
just check out our channel, and there's some really good sort of coverage
Yes.
of that term. But I totally agree.
I'll link them below.
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
fits into this
Yeah.
because a lot of preconceived notions are based on these symbols
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
well, I do things this way, and so if that person is not doing things this way, they are trying to cause conflict,
Right.
or
Right.
don't understand me,
Yeah.
right? That latter part might be true,
Yeah.
but then
But you
you
don't
may not
know.
understand them either.
Right. And they
right?
might have the same feelings about you.
Yeah.
Right. So it goes both ways. The other thing that you can factor into this is being cognizant of any cross-cultural communication barriers or obstacles, because again, with a different cultural background or linguistic background or field of experience, there I'm using a modal, some friction, right? It's not necessarily a given. It's not, all the time that way, but do keep in mind that maybe if you're conversing with someone and you're both from different, cultural backgrounds, there might be different ways of, your nonverbals might be different. Maybe, smiling is not something that they express in that culture. I'm just making some stuff up, but
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It could very well be a cultural thing, and you have to be open to that.
Totally. Yeah. And a lot of these I think manifest very early in your conversation, right? An example is in China, where I lived
Yeah.
for several years
Yeah.
and grew up actually, because Hong Kong's technically China now.
Yeah.
But in any event, I would find that the Chinese didn't really say much of please. Could you please do this? Could you please do that?
It was just not part of the
Right. You don't
vernacular.
say please. You just ask for what it is you
Yeah,
ask
and that's
for.
considered polite,
And that's
right?
considered
That
polite.
is the polite way of asking.
Right. Or it's the expected way. And when I would speak Chinese, I would always add pleases into my sort of conversation.
Yeah.
And thank yous as well. It's the same concept with
Yeah.
thank yous. And people would say, you don't need to say please.
Yeah.
Stop saying thank you. Stop thanking me. And in fact, they found that to be distancing.
Right.
Because
That's
people
interesting.
close to you would not expect a please and thank you, right?
Yeah.
If the closer you are to someone, the less formality you would expect. So why say please and thank you? That suggests that we're not close,
Right.
right?
Right.
So it's just this funny thing that
Yeah.
can manifest very early on in a
Yeah.
relationship, in a
Yeah.
conversation,
Yeah.
that two cultures do it so differently that there could be conflict stemming from that. At least
Absolutely.
cognitive dissonance.
Yes,
right?
cognitive dissonance and confusion that can abound from that.
Yeah.
One thing that I remember, so I spent a lot of time in Turkey. While Greg was in China, I was in Turkey. And I learned so much. It was such an amazing experience for me to be there. I learned the language and the culture, and I made a lot of wonderful friends, and I treasure those moments very much. And one of the fun things was, I remember early on in my immersion, we were at someone's house, and in Turkish culture, they're very hospitable. So whenever you have someone over, you are, putting out the whole beautiful, arrangement of all
Spread.
these dishes. Yeah, you have a smorgasbord of amazing dishes, and they want you to enjoy the food, and you want to keep eating it. They want you to keep eating it. So when somebody comes around with another, let's say your second or third plate, yeah, believe it or not, you better go hungry there. They'll ask you, would you like some more? And so in American culture, when we say thank you, wait, now I'm getting all confused. See, cross-cultural.
I know.
When we say thank you, yes, you can add more food, right? Yes, thank you, right? So add more food. I would love an extra.
Right. Would you like some more?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right? That would be a gesture for more,
Yeah.
another helping.
I would serve you more if you said thank you.
Precisely. But in Turkish culture, when you say thank you, that means no. In that context, you'll say teşekkürler and they'll walk away. And then it's so I remember saying I did want another,
Right.
a second helping of something. And I said, thank you. And they walked away. So I couldn't
Where are they going?
figure out. I was like, wait, no, I do want more.
Yeah.
So I remember that being a funny.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, that stuff happens all
So
the
it
time.
happens.
And it's easy to be frustrated by that. or
I
put
could have
off
been
by
like,
it.
why aren't they giving me food? Did they not want to give me another helping of it?
Right.
And then in French culture, again, around food, because I also spent a lot of time in France, another wonderful place. I also know that language, so it was fun to learn. So we would have a plate of food, and you're supposed to, if you enjoy the meal, you're supposed to leave one tiny little piece of food on your plate to show that you enjoyed the food. If you clean your plate entirely, that's actually it's actually an insult to the chef or the person who served you, the host, because you're basically saying you didn't feed me enough. I'm still hungry.
Right.
And then if you leave too much on your plate, that means I didn't really like the food. It wasn't that good. So you're supposed to leave. So let's say imagine a pea, right? Leave just one pea on your plate. That suffices, and that's sufficient. And you can then show the host that you relished the meal.
So let's take that example now.
Yeah,
And let's
and
look at
bring
it from
it-
both perspectives,
Yes,
right? So
yes.
from the perspective of you as the guest, you're there, you finish your plate clean.
Licking
and you're
it
all
and
proud
everything.
of yourself. You're like, wow, I really impressed this host and showed them how much I liked this
Yeah,
food. Meanwhile, the host is like, oh gosh,
Oh gosh, I don't
I
have
didn't
anything
cook
else
enough
in my
food.
pantry.
This is so embarrassing,
Embarrassing.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so two people can have a completely different perspective, and you assume you're making a good impression,
And that's the symbolic
Right.
interactionism
and
effect,
and
right?
they're worried that they're making a bad impression,
Right, because they didn't serve you enough
But
food.
here's the kicker:
Yeah.
they then get uncomfortable, and you
Right.
start to pick up on that vibe, and suddenly it goes from this positive situation
Yep.
into a spiraling down situation where
yeah.
they're uncomfortable, which makes
Right.
you uncomfortable, which
Right.
starts to stifle the conversation.
Because we pick up on that as humans. Like we
Exactly.
can immediately
Exactly.
read the micro expressions, the pauses, the intonalities, and all of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that can start to happen.
Yeah.
So let's apply then this open-mindedness to the situation, right? The first, as the host, you see them finish the plate. As the host, you're concerned about that.
Yeah.
You know that normally people don't finish the plate in your house, and suddenly someone's finished the plate. But this is someone from a different country, right? Someone you haven't met before. So maybe they finish the plate because they're really hungry.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's just what they do.
Or maybe
But-
they enjoyed it so much they wanted to eat every single morsel of food on their
Right.
plate.
Maybe they want more.
Yeah.
And so, but your job then is to probe it a little bit, right? Instead of being embarrassed about it, you say, "Oh, I saw you finish the plate. I'm so sorry we don't have any more.
Yeah.
I can prepare something else for you."
Yeah.
And then the guest can say, "Actually, I'm totally full. I just was
full.
so good. I
Yeah.
couldn't help finishing the plate."
Exactly.
Right? And then conversations, can continue.
Yeah.
And everyone's happy.
Right. So I
Right.
love that because that way it gives you a chance to maybe verbalize on that action, right? Instead of leaving something open to interpretation, knowing that you might not have read that symbol of finishing the plate the same way, then you can always add that extra think of it as adding a subtitle, right? I love that because it's like you have the image of the video or the movie and then you have the subtitle saying,
Totally.
"That was so great. How did you make that? I would love to get the recipe. I'm not hungry anymore. This was perfect. So satisfying."
Yeah.
Right?
A great comment from Yasmin, which is there's a famous phrase, "Come, whoever you are."
Oh, yeah. Is that a Rumi
Right.
quote? I think it's Rumi.
Love yes,
that.
it is Rumi.
Okay.
Yeah, come, whoever you are, right? Anyone is welcome. And-
Beautiful. I
and
love that.
The more diverse the crowd, the more interesting ideas
For sure.
can be raised, and the more engaging the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I
Right?
think part of why we love going abroad so much and traveling, I mean, right now no one's traveling. We're not traveling. But when we do have that opportunity and
As my brother says, in the before times.
yeah, in the before time, the before
Before,
the
before.
poor. Yeah. The before.
The before.
One thing that really resonates so well with us is that there's such a diverse group. It's just such a cool way of mixing different worldviews and cultures. So you are bound to learn something new and meet people and
Yeah.
learn, different traditions. I love that. It's just so cool. It just adds an extra dynamic layer to our existence, right? So
Yeah.
having these open mind perspectives is going to really benefit you because you'll be able to maybe travel, you'll be able to maybe live in another country for a while, you'll be able to maybe take a job that requires another language, you'll be, all these things. So cross-cultural communication definitely fits into this whole idea, this notion of having an open mind
Exactly.
with first impressions or just in interactions in general, right, Greg?
Totally.
Yeah.
And what's great about it is it absolutely applies to when you're traveling. It can be very local, right?
For sure.
It can be your neighbor, right?
Oh, totally,
It can be
totally.
you started a new job and it's your new colleague, right, or your new boss. All these situations, you're encountering someone who may have a different perspective than you do, or is just used to doing things differently than you do, and by adopting an open mindset, you're much more likely to get off on the right foot. And that's particularly important if you're planning to spend a lot of time with them, which is,
Right.
where this really matters. When you meet someone and then you don't have to hang out with them after that, it's less of a big deal.
Yeah.
You still, are
Yeah.
going to benefit from having an open mind. You'll
For
have a
sure.
more interesting conversation. But this is particularly powerful if this is someone who you're going to be
In regular
stuck with,
contact
for better or
with.
worse, for a long period of time. this is where this really is powerful, because the sooner you can orient your mind toward seeing that person in a positive light, the better off you're going to be, right? The happier you're going to be, the more
sure.
comfortable you are going to be around them.
Yeah, for sure. And we didn't touch too much upon the making the first impression, but there are a couple of things that I just want to share with you quickly. When you're trying to put your best foot forward in an interaction, in a first introduction rather, you want to think about having, a positive disposition. Now, for some people that might mean smiling. Like, I'm a smiler, but not everyone is, and that's okay. But, as long as you can show that you're being positive and you're speaking in a positive way, a comforting and positive tonality, open body language, right? Not like closed off and like, hunched over and like grimacing, but having that like open, welcome body language. We pick up on these, right? So if you can do your best and be aware of that kind of signal that you're sending out with your body language, with your nonverbals, and also with your positive disposition, then that's really going to take you far in making a good impression on someone. Right?
And it's reciprocal too, right?
It's reciprocal.
When they see that,
yes,
they then start to respond with more positive and warm and friendly body language.
For sure.
And language, like spoken language.
Yeah.
So the more warmth you give off, the more warmth you're going to receive. That's the beauty of human interaction. These interactions feed off each other.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can make them positive, that can engender this positive feedback loop.
Yeah. And then that sets the ground for building rapport and finding common ground between you.
Yeah.
So picking up on things that they're passionate about, right? You can tell when someone's interested in something by the way they speak about it. There's a little bit of passion so maybe someone's, they love baseball, and the way they talk about baseball, you can just tell like they're ready to like bat, and make a home run, or I don't know, whatever. But you can tell when someone's excited about that. So you might not be a huge baseball aficionado or even play the sport, but you can ask them about it, right? And finding that kind of common ground is super, super beneficial when you're trying to create that positive impression. And also, it's just a great way to have these positive, authentic interactions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we're running up against the time limit here, but hopefully this was helpful in getting more comfortable with the idea of meeting people that are who are different than you,
right?
And getting off on the right foot. Because again, as we open up, saying by getting off on the right foot, you can have a much more productive conversation. You can have a much better outcome, and more importantly, if these are people you're spending or expecting to spend more time with, you can set a really good foundation, a strong, sturdy foundation for a productive and fruitful relationship.
That's right. Yeah. So think about things also like in the long term, right?
Yeah.
From that angle, it'll really benefit you. So that's a wrap on this live stream. Be sure to check out our other videos, our other lessons. Subscribe to our newsletter. You'll hear from us weekly. We also came up with a great web course. So if you're interested in that, you can I'll link it below. And it's also in the community tab. So
yes, it's all about working remotely.
Yeah. So if that's something that strikes your fancy, then mosey on over.
Check it out.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. And
thank you.
We will catch you next week.
That's right. Happy exploring, everyone.
And have a great weekend.
Bye.